Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Rachel Goldbrenner, the Executive Director of the Reiss Center on Law and Security. Together with Just Security, we're pleased to be convening today's discussion on reporting at a crossroads, national security, democracy, and the challenges to a free press. Thanks for joining us. At the Reiss Center, we produce thinking on the legal, policy, and strategic questions that we think will shape the national security field for years to come. Often that means looking at law and policy around war powers or geopolitical developments or any number of other traditional issues. Today, it brings us to convene a conversation with leading journalists and legal minds on the issue of national security reporting and the free press. Policymaking on national security issues is one of the most consequential functions our government performs. And independent reporting is a crucial element of ensuring that the American public can evaluate those decisions by their elected officials and that we can have debate and new thinking on complex questions. At a time when the media landscape is characterized by many new or newly acute challenges, as so many here and elsewhere have tracked and written about, we're grateful to have this group of frontline experts with us to discuss and reflect on essential questions of this moment and to tell us, what is it like to lead a newsroom and report on national security issues today? Which legal issues are top of mind? What are some of the most pressing challenges and maybe also opportunities in this field? To moderate this conversation, we're truly fortunate to have Kate Brennan with us today. Kate's a non-resident journalism fellow at the Reiss Center and an accomplished foreign policy and national security editor and reporter with experience at outlets such as Foreign Affairs, Just Security, and Politico. It's a privilege to have her rich experience and depth of thinking in our community of experts at the Reiss Center. And with that, Kate, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our speakers and get the conversation started.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Rachel. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm so excited for this discussion because it's a chance for me to ask some of the questions that have been on my mind as I've watched the media weather this really difficult moment. And we have a fantastic panel today to help us answer some of these questions. First, we have Beck Hamilton. Beck is an executive editor at Just Security and a professor at the American University Washington College of Law. Previously, Beck served as a lawyer at the International Criminal Court. And important to this conversation, she worked as a journalist as well before going to law school and a foreign correspondent at the Washington Post and Reuters. Next, we have Ben Pauker. Ben is the editor of the national security team at the Washington Post. And for years, Ben has led teams of reporters covering the Pentagon, the intelligence community, and foreign policy, giving him a front row seat into how newsrooms are changing in this moment. Next, we have Missy Ryan. Missy is a journalist who's covered the Pentagon through multiple administrations and under various secretaries of defense. And today she's a staff writer at The Atlantic. And before that, she worked at the Washington Post and Reuters, where she served as the deputy bureau chief in Baghdad. And last but not least, we have David McCraw, the lead newsroom lawyer at the New York Times, where he's also the deputy general counsel. In addition to advising the newsroom on libel issues and other legal matters, David's one of the country's foremost and most prolific FOIA litigators, uncovering documents on everything from drone strikes to Epstein files. So I just want to thank you all for joining us and taking your time out of your extremely busy days to come and answer some of our questions. And I'm going to start with Beck, who has been tracking how the Trump administration is using state power against the media and has a new piece out with the latest trends. And I'd love Beck to help us frame the conversation we're going to be having, to tell us a little bit about what you've been tracking and why it's important to step back from the day-to-day attacks and insults and news stories to kind of see the bigger picture about what's going on and what the trends tell us.
Thanks so much, Kate. The tracking that I've been doing really started out of a personal need, sort of a few months, really even a few weeks into the second Trump administration, being hit by this barrage of breaking news. There was executive orders, there was resignations, there was rescissions of funding. And I thought, if I don't systematize this information, then I'm going to lose it. So I wanted to figure out how to keep sight of the forest, notwithstanding the trees. The other thing I was really worried about was that we could take a snapshot of press freedom in this country in January 2025 and take another snapshot in November 2028 and find the two to be unrecognizable. But if we were actually living inside the system day to day, we might just normalize it. And so this was a way of collating the information and organizing it into a literal snapshot. So you can see on Just Security now, every time I issue an update, we've got this incredible graphic that puts all of these pieces of information into these different threats. Some of the threats are obvious. So I'm looking at hostility of conditions that journalists are facing. And this is everything from the awful rhetoric that is coming from the very top, just disparaging and demeaning journalists, especially female journalists and journalists of color. The lawsuits that are being lodged against just journalists doing their ordinary jobs. Coupled with that, we have a trend that is really about the erosion of access to public officials. And we're going to speak a lot in this conversation, I think, about what the changes that have been imposed at the Pentagon would be one example of that. We saw it also right out of the gate, the decision for banning AP from, from the White House. And I think, putting those together, it's very clear that journalism is a disfavored profession right now. And so the next trend is a sort of a reflection of that, which is looking at self-censorship, which is something that we see creeping in under any kind of system that is moving towards autocracy. And that's a little harder to really kind of identify or put your finger on, because often you will see it reported as a dispute between a journalist and an editor. The journalist says this is censorship. The editor says, no, it's something else. It's within editorial discretion. But when you see enough of them in context, you can figure out what's going on. And we had that early on with high-profile disputes, in particular at the Washington Post, with Ann Talamis, with Ruth Marcus. We saw Karen Attier. So those are kind of under the radar things that are easy to miss unless you're keeping track. And then at a really macro level, there is aggressive use of state power against media outlets. So investigations that most legal experts would agree are effectively frivolous. Investigations by the FCC, these high dollar value lawsuits, and on the other side of that, the rescissions of funding that had already been granted, the effort to dismantle public reporting institutions. And the sort of flip side of that one is media corporations in particular seeking to curry favor with the Trump administration. That was a move that we saw early on, even in advance of the inauguration. So settlement, ABC, Meta, multi-million-dollar settlements with Trump over lawsuits that really could have been won if they'd been litigated in court. And that was sort of a depressing early sign. However, to try and add a little bit of positivity to the conversation, in the last update, we've seen some growing pushback and resistance by media organizations. And I don't know the causality of this, but accompanying that trend, we're seeing successes in court. And, David would be able to speak to this, but the New York Times was the only one that went against the Pentagon pledge in litigation. A lot of other outlets opposed it rhetorically, but it's led to a victory in court. We've seen the same thing with the litigation recently that Voice of America has been pursuing, the Wall Street Journal's defamation, Trump's defamation suit against the Wall Street Journal. A judge has recently found in favor of the Wall Street Journal. Courts are slow, but slowly we're accumulating some victories for press freedom, at least at the federal court level.
Okay, that's a great overarching description of what we're seeing. And one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation, especially with Ben and Missy and David, is because you are in the newsroom, you are living this, you are experiencing it, and you know exactly how, if and whether it's affecting your news gathering and how. I want to turn to David and ask you, you wrote a book about what it was like to lead the New York Times through the first Trump administration. And when he was elected the first time, there were concerns that his presidency would mean the end of press freedom as we know it. We lived through that. It wasn't. Is there more cause for concern, for alarm now? And where do you sort of stand and see the issue at the moment?
Well, a lawyer friend described my book as a beach read for lawyers, which probably doesn't say much for lawyers. But it had a pretty upbeat tone despite everything that was going on. I'm not sure I'd be able to pull that off this time. Um, and I felt that in the first administration, the guardrails were a little wobbly, but they remained in place. I'm not sure those guardrails are there anymore. And Beck really highlighted a lot of this. But when I think about it, I always begin by asking, what does a healthy information ecosystem look like? And there's three big components I see. One is access, one is journalists, news organizations, and one is an engaged public. And you see the administration taking on all of those. The access getting strangled, whether it's in FOIA, whether it's in the firing of inspectors general, all those things that have been the traditional place where information would come into the system, you see being pinched and in some ways strangled. News media, what you need is strong news organizations that are able to hold power to account. All kinds of problems facing those news organizations today, financially and with AI stealing our stuff willy-nilly and competing against us. I had to put that in there, thanks to our suit against OpenAI. And some of the things Beck talked about, where you have this whole of government approach, EOC investigation of the New York Times, FTC investigation of Media Matters, the FCC run amok on the networks. And then in the third sphere, the poisoning of the public with the constant drumbeat of fake news and enemy of the people, and you're committing treason just the other day. And when you read that when you read that the White House has called the press the enemy of the people, purveyors of fake news, all of that. And then 5 days later, you find out that the FBI has raided the home of a Washington Post reporter. Those two events aren't unrelated. That the more they succeed in delegitimizing the press in the public's mind, the easier it is to do the kind of things that will actually legally harm and otherwise harm news organizations. So I do think the situation has taken much of a turn for the worse.
Just to follow up on those three guardrails, or not the guardrails, but these three areas: access, newsroom, and public engagement. Is there one of those three that has changed the most from the first administration to this one, or are they kind of all three being undermined?
Well, I think the attack on the news organizations is gone to a different level.
Uh-huh.
I think the hearts and mind problem was there
Yeah.
very much so in the first administration. I don't think the alliance with the major social media companies I didn't have to deal with in the first administration. You now see that X cut loose from any sort of mooring. And access to information has obviously been escalated, but I would focus on the middle one.
Okay. Ben, I want to turn to you next. And as we've heard about what's going on, and we've obviously all read about what's going on, I want to know how you've experienced it in your position and what's changed about your job, what, if anything, has changed about what reporters need from you these days, and what it's like to lead a national security team covering this administration.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you all for this conversation. In some ways, very little has changed. I've never uh, been an editor or worked at a place that during an administration, both Democratic and Republican, that really ever wanted national security stories told the way we intend to tell them, whether that was in the Obama administration, certainly in the Biden administration, and in this one. So I think that in large part we have a clear vision of what the public what we are asked to do, what the public is entitled to from strong, aggressive, respectful, objective journalism about national security issues. It is certainly the case that this is an administration that does not want to play ball, that they are aggressive, and their hold on what we would consider the truth to be is very tenuous at best. Other administrations have sort of alluded to in previous years would sell you a story this way. They try to paint a narrative of something. It is, I think, fair to say that this administration will outright lie about the things that they do and then misconstrue that. We go to them for quotes, we go to them for comment. But as I think, Missy and others here and our viewers would see, the quotes that we get back are malicious in intent. You asked what reporters need from me most these days. Truly, I don't think editors do very much. We give a pep talk now and again, some big thinking ideas that reporters generally ignore. We move some words around, tighten a lead here and there. But I think some of the most important things, and we have certainly done this at the Post recently, is ensure the reporters that the masthead is behind them. And that's, a level up from me or two. This is a climate where there is fear, there is concern. I think, as David and Rebecca have said, we have seen some true breaking of norms. The FBI raid on Hannah Nathanson's home was felt very strongly across the newsroom, and there was a lot of deep and I think very valid concern. I think this administration is a year and a half in. I think we've only scratched the surface at present, and I'm concerned that we will see things that feel fundamentally dangerous to the pursuit of journalism and have a chilling effect both on newsrooms and on sources as well. And maybe we can get back to that at some point. But I think the most important thing that news organizations can do, and the New York Times and the Atlantic have certainly done this for its reporters, and the Washington Post as well, is to ensure them that a strong and vocal masthead stands behind them and their work, and a smart and aggressive legal team.
Okay. Missy, similar question to you, just about how you've lived through the changes that we have heard described, but also taking it specifically to the Pentagon, which probably I think has experienced the most drastic changes when it comes to press access. If you could walk us through a little bit about what's happened there, just sort of big picture, the changes and how they've affected your reporting, if they have at all.
Sure. Well, can you guys hear me? Okay, great. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to NYU and to Just Security for having me and for really, especially, shining a light on this really important issue and the work that you've done back on trying to, bring together what is this disparate picture of the evolving media situation. It's really valuable. And it's such a good question. The Pentagon does seem like it's ground zero for a lot of the most pernicious trends that we're seeing across the administration in terms of restricting what has been, decades long traditions in terms of media access. So the Atlantic and the Post and most of the mainstream media organizations that covered the Pentagon and had offices there or desks refused to sign a updated media protocol and agreement that the Pentagon under Hegseth put out last fall. And essentially it amounted to what we saw as a restriction on our ability to ask questions and do the fundamental work of a free press. And it was kind of amounted to prior restraint in as a a lawyer, I feel like I can say, that's what it felt like to us. We weren't going to be able to ask questions. In most circumstances, it's certainly related to classified information. So we refused to sign that. And most of us had our credentials revoked, meaning that we no longer had regular access to the Pentagon. And now that's subject to ongoing litigation led by the New York Times, which is very encouraging to see that there have been 2 decisions in favor of the Times. So that's, we don't really know where that'll land. And my suspicion is that even if there are continued decisions in favor of the media and traditional media access, the Pentagon is going to do its best to make that look different than it did in the past. I think that, a lot of this boils down to Pete Hegseth himself and his longstanding views about the mainstream media. He proudly talked about not being a journalist in his years at Fox. He saw himself as a commentator, as a partisan advocate, and he had a lot of disregard for the traditional media and our kind of normal ways of doing things. So I think a lot of it is led by him. He has brought in a new media, which is, a number of organizations that do now have credentials. We have occasional access to press briefings, but it's nothing like we had before. So to answer your question directly, it's not good for democracy in terms of what that signals. But on the other hand, we continue to do our jobs, and there are many talented, dogged reporters, including the reporters, my former colleagues at the Post that Ben leads, who do amazing work day in and day out. Everybody's got sources that they've had for years. It's unfortunate that we can't be there in person, but there has been continued to be a steady stream of scoops of the kinds of stories that you would have seen prior to these changes. So if Hegseth's goal was to crack down on the information getting out of the Pentagon, it hasn't worked, at least on absolute terms. It is harder, however, to get people to go on the record, or to go on the record, to go on background, to talk at all, not because of the in-person access restrictions per se, but more because of the chilling effect that his attitude has on the people up and down the chain, and also now his promises to root out leaks and potentially prosecute them, as we're seeing the administration do in certain cases.
To follow up on the question of the chilling of sources, do you see any difference in the cultures as you report across the military, the intelligence community, the Hill? Is one group more nervous than another?
My experience, and I also cover the State Department to the extent that I'm able to make time for that, given everything that's going on at DOD, which we continue to call it DOD, because that remains the statutory name, not the Department of War, is that it's most acute in the Defense Department. And, the IC has always been a really tough nut to crack. But I think the change that I've seen has been most significant in the military, just because of a relatively open status that there was for many years. I started covering the military in 2008 when I went to work in Iraq, and there was a tradition of, seeing it as a duty to open up to the American public via the media and, tell people what, their sons and daughters were doing. In military operations, what the military leaders were doing with American taxpayer dollars. So I think that's been the biggest change. However, there is fear across the State Department and across the other agencies, just because of it's not unique to DoD. It's maybe just the biggest change, relatively speaking, I would say.
And then a question for you and Ben, maybe, but when it comes to Pentagon press briefings now, there may or may not be a reporter from the Times or the Post or another mainstream outlet in the room. Does your attitude about covering them change a bit in terms of their usefulness?
Well, thanks to David and the Times' good legal work, the Post is now occasionally allowed into some of the briefings, most of which have been Hegseth and Kane of late, giving Iran war updates. I think we have the honor of having the last seat in all the rows in a corner. which, ironically, I think our reporters are it's a badge of honor in a respect. They are then summarily ushered out of the building as soon as press conferences are over. I think they would reflect what Missy wisely said, that it does feel like a change. I think in some respects, the ability to engage with people at the Pentagon and have conversations that I think American readers and need to know about, especially in breaking news moments, are more difficult to have. Sourcing is still, as you can see from our reporting, sourcing is still available in all sorts of different ways, but it has changed. The threats about rooting out leakers, about polygraph testing, those are real, and they do have an effect on our sources and ability and willingness to engage with reporters, even over very normal things, normal questions.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that it does make it harder to get real-time accurate information, setting aside embeds, which clearly are not happening right now. I remember covering everything going back to the Libya war, every kind of foreign bombing that we did off, at the beginning of some sort of bombing campaign. You would have all the journalists camped out there at 7 p.m. on a Friday night. We all thought something would happen, and we would be there with the officials from the Joint Staff or from the Office of the Secretary of Defense who could talk to us in real time and give us the nuances that we could then convey to our readers and our viewers in a way that I actually think really served the American people. And the other significant change that I will say in terms of the impact of the lack of access is just that we don't know the officials who are making the decisions in the same way that we did before. I've covered 10 secretaries of defense. I traveled around with secretaries and chairmen, starting with Robert Gates, and getting those kind of informal times where you're, at the hotel lobby bar or you're on the plane and just chatting, not just with the principal, the decision maker, the general or the secretary, but also their staff. It allows you to get a sense of the person, and then you can bring their background, like their views on things, to a kind of more complete coverage. And Hegseth, only takes a very select group of media with him. And I'm not aware of the Post having gone. The Atlantic certainly hasn't gone. And that just is, and same thing with Dan Kane, the new chairman, same thing with Brad Cooper, the CENTCOM commander. And really that is a significant impediment in, bringing the issues to light and bringing it home in a more human, holistic way.
As Ben said, we're only a year and a half in, and we're probably just scratching the surface of what we might see here. But is there anything for David and Beck? Is there anything that you thought might come to pass that hasn't, whether it's libel cases or things like that? And then to follow up from that, where do you see the trends going, just looking a little bit down the road? David, if you want to start us.
Yeah. So many bad things have happened. It's hard to pick out which bad one hasn't. In some ways, and this is underscores what Missy and Ben have said. Reporting has gone on. I mean, the level of journalism around the war in Iran by a variety of publications and outlets has really been quite extraordinary, and unhappy making, I know, for the administration, and just incredible. Congratulations to everybody who carries on despite everything. In terms of national security leaks and investigation of national security leaks, which I think is probably the most specific way to look at this, put aside the president's libel suits and all that. There's three levels of escalation. You start with the administration decides to investigate and prosecute people in government as sources. We don't like that, but it's part of the bargain. That's kind of how the system is set up to work, right? Is that they have an obligation to pursue national security leaks. And the hope always is that they will use great discretion in doing that. So if you look at the 30 years prior to President Obama, there were 4 of those kind of prosecutions. You see a ramp up under Obama, you see a ramp up under Trump, you see an end to it under Biden. Now, ramp up again. But we understand that's sort of how the things go. They have an obligation to protect secrets. The second level, the escalation, though, is when they then start subpoenaing reporters. And we feel that should be done in the rarest of circumstance, if ever at all. The Biden administration vowed not to do it. They lived up to that vow, and things went on fine, for the national security state and certainly for journalists. But the idea that Hannah Nathanson's home is going to be raided, not only a subpoena to the Post, but a raid of a home is such an escalation. The Justice Department for decades has taken the position that in a leak investigation, they would seek information from the reporter only as a last resort. And it was clear that in the Post case, it was a first resort. They actually had already found the person they were looking for to charge with leaking, and they still engaged in that. Quite extraordinary. And then the third level, which we haven't seen, and so if you're really looking for that bad thing, is will they prosecute a journalist under the national security laws? We've seen that with Julian Assange, but nobody but Julian Assange. The DOJ at the time, said that Julian was different from journalists. I'm never quite sure how they made that distinction, since he was in fact charged with receiving and publishing national security information, which is what we all do. But that's really the next tier, is if you see not merely attempting to make journalists into witnesses, but to make them suspects and defendants in criminal cases.
Okay.
Well, I would agree. I would agree with David that there's been so much that's awful. It's hard to think what one might have imagined that would have been worse, and I think it is the direct prosecutions of journalists. But I also think it's really important to point out that what we've already seen has had its greatest impact so far, I think, on within the profession of journalists, those that are already the most marginalized and vulnerable. So I think it was Ben said something really important about knowing that you have your masthead behind you. But what about the journalists out there that don't have a big masthead behind them to start with? And, in any situation, and this is to thinking about the fact that we've still got years and years to go of this administration, you do see the most vulnerable in any group picked up first. So Mario Guevara deported after doing reporting on ICE raids, Stephanie Rodriguez detained after doing reporting on ICE raids, and they don't have a big masthead behind them to support them. Don Lemon, Georgia Fort, same kind of situation, arrested for just doing their jobs without having a media organization with resources to back them up. So this picking off of the most vulnerable. And somebody maybe on this call can confirm the reporting about the FBI investigating Sarah Fitzpatrick for her reporting on FBI Director Kash Patel. That's more in that trend that we've been seeing of these FBI investigations of journalists. And so, in terms of going forward, I think recognizing that this is a time-worn strategy. You pick off the most sort of vulnerable pieces of the system and do a divide and conquer. And what I would love to see, that we've seen little glimmers of, but really not as much as I was hoping, is a sort of collective action mentality across media outlets. We saw it with the refusals to sign the so-called Pentagon pledge that Missy was talking about. But I think there is power in numbers, and particularly when so many of these actions are really they're legally dubious in their foundations, and they're winnable in court. And so to just have single organizations rolling over in response to them is really, really troubling, both in terms of the individual case itself, but also the message that it sends. Back to this conversation about the chilling effects. That's why the collective action piece of this, I think, is really important, and that I think is going to become more important if we're going to survive through the remainder of this term.
David, to stay with you and this question of collective action, do you feel like the Times has fewer compatriots these days in the fight to protect press freedom as there's more media consolidation and alignment with the administration? How does it feel? How many friends do you have in the fight?
We have lots of friends. Do they show up to our parties? That's the question. The Look, this is always a hard thing. I take Beck's point, but this is a hard thing. We are competitors. And the public benefits from the fact that we compete against each other. So it's with caution that we take collective action. The other thing is that when we take collective action, there is we sort of contribute to this narrative of us versus them, that the press is all lined up against President Trump. We are adversarial to every government, not just to President Trump. We're adversarial to every government. That's an important part of how journalism works. So it's never that easy for us, but there are ways that we've traditionally done that with the amicus briefs, with joint action for access to documents in courts and the like. And I think now there is greater reluctance. I'm going to admit that from among many of our peers, those that are in regulated industries, broadcasting, I think are concerned about the very thing that Ben raised, which is their management standing behind them? I think the whatever a masthead is at a broadcast company, that they probably have support at that level, but that is their company going to stand behind them on these things? And there's no question that the finances, the resources available have not what they once were, and that contributes to it. I think people are picking their shots, but I really think, and this point's been made earlier, that one of the things that does concern me, and I spoke about this at the Community Direct Journalism, that anticipatory obedience, where we decide not to do something out of fear that something's about to happen. I applaud my publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, for pushing ahead on the Pentagon case. And he made a really simple point, which is we may lose, but there are worse things than losing. We'd rather have a judge tell us we're wrong than to just assume that we couldn't get any place, or letting the Pentagon tell us how they're going to set a policy for press passes.
And if I can just quickly add to that, I mean, David, your work and the New York Times's work on the Pentagon access case was, I think we're all extremely proud of it. I know that you and I talked a number of times about the collective action problem. Back there was lots of conversation among media leaders to try and muster efforts. In the end, it was only the Times, and we're all thankful for that. But as Missy also said before, even in a case such as this, whether you win or lose, it really feels, again, not speaking as a lawyer here, it really feels like a matter of principle. As Missy knows, the Pentagon would most likely find another way to restrict access to reporters, to pick and choose, to allow them within certain corridors within the letter of a law, even if the Times's action is successful.
Yeah, and I underscore what Missy and Ben have said here, that a lot of people question the value of being in the Pentagon, and I get that, especially under the current administration. But Missy is right that there is something that happens by being in the building. And Julian Barnes, who is a co-plaintiff in our case, put in a couple declarations, which did a very nice job of just explaining it's not the traditional reporting that leads to big scoops, but it is the traditional reporting that lays the groundwork for the kind of reporting that the public counts on.
I want to be sure to save some time to talk about covering an administration at war, which is its kind of own thing, and how, first of all, to Missy, how has covering the Pentagon, if it has at all, one of the goals of this conversation is to figure out what exactly has changed and what hasn't changed. Has covering the Pentagon changed? Has it become more restrictive, even more restrictive since the war with Iran started? And if you could compare what it's like to cover the Trump administration at war with what it was like to cover the Bush administration or the first Trump administration, kind of what's different? What are you used to getting that you're not getting outside of the Pentagon access? Talk us through a little bit about what that's been like.
Sure. So there have been a lot of different iterations of this American media, or the media generally, covering American conflicts since, in the post 9/11 era. And, the kind of large scale embedded reporting that occurred after the 2003 invasion and then after Iraq really was not replicated during the smaller counterinsurgent conflicts that followed that, everything US involvement in some of the Arab Spring conflicts, the ISIS conflict. And that is, I think, largely because the nature of the American military involvement was so different. That said, the military did make an effort to provide some level of access in terms of, occasionally letting US reporters go out to a ship in the Mediterranean that was part of the US operations on against Gaddafi, or going out to bases in Syria occasionally in a much more limited way. However, that was still valuable access. It's not happening now at all that I'm aware of. And that just kind of narrows the aperture, the visibility that Americans have about what is happening in their name in this war that, again, we also know had very little prior debate, prior discussion on a national level. So I think that really deprives people from understanding what the troops are feeling, what they're experiencing. And that's relevant as we've seen military casualties occur in places like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. People weren't necessarily even aware that American forces were at an air base in Saudi Arabia or this port facility in Kuwait. And I think that's all to the detriment of the way that we understand this. There also hasn't been, the same kind of visibility on daily operational issues from U.S. Central Command. That is a function of the commands, even if they're even if they're more inclined to share information, and I think they are. These are the military, as everybody here knows, has this massive public affairs apparatus, hundreds and hundreds of people, most of whom came up during a more transparent era. They actually want to get the military story out. However, they're really scared now, and they are, it's a very top-down controlled situation, and they're afraid of making a mistake. They're afraid of being fired. This is an administration that won't hesitate to take retaliation against people who misstep, especially if it's perceived to be in favor of political enemies, and the media is included in that bucket.
Okay. And Ben, I wanted to ask you, the Post recently had a story about Iranian airstrikes and how they'd caused far more damage at U.S. military sites across the Middle East than the Pentagon had previously acknowledged. Is that level of secrecy normal in your experience with an administration sort of talking about what's going on in theater? And how has the Pentagon reacted to that story? And if at all, was there back and forth that you can talk about in the run up to it?
I mean, there's always back and forth with a story like that. I think this is, perhaps some of the listeners saw this. This was a story that we did in conjunction with another team where we employed some of the great visual forensic journalists here at the Post, and really set a broad aperture at looking at Iranian strikes from missiles and drones that had pierced the defenses of U.S. bases across the region. We certainly engaged the Pentagon and the White House and other and CENTCOM and different commands as we always do for a story like this. But what Missy said is very accurate, that they have a narrative that comes very much from the top down at the Pentagon about a story they want to tell about the Iran war, which is that it may not even be a war. We've already won it. That any questioning about whether or not it has been successful is unpatriotic, if not traitorous. I think our reporters, and I would imagine Missy, and certainly people at the Atlantic and the Times would feel the same way. So it is a harder environment, I would say, just to add to Missy's comment. Of course, we're not, the Post journalists are not getting embeds. They don't have access to the Pentagon. And that is 100% because of this administration's policies and priorities and their hostility to the media. But we've also seen an ecosystem change since the last time America went to war in a serious way in the Middle East, which is you have, something that we all face and think about. It's a creator economy, a TikTok media ecosystem where it is easier for the Pentagon to get their message out through hand-picked creators or through their own channels, where I think they don't need some of the major media organizations in the same way to tell a version of the story that they might have otherwise wanted to tell.
Okay, to stay on that, I wanted to return to David's three sort of areas that are being undermined: the access, the newsrooms, and the public engagement, and just throw it open to everybody to talk about that third piece, which Ben just talked about, the public engagement and where the public is getting its news from, and how that's changing, and how you feel your stories are being read. Do they feel like they have the same impact that they used to? Do you use the same channels to sort of promote them? How is that piece of it changing just from your sort of foxhole?
I mean, I'm old, and we still do the things the same way. No, truly, the engagement that we get on our stories is very high. I think they do crack through. I am not addicted to the sort of internal newsroom metrics that people check, Chartbeat, things like that. They can have a temporary sort of ameliorative impact. But truly, we think about our stories. In a sort of broader sense, and I know Missy and the Atlantic do the same. We're trying to tell important stories, and we sort of have our own direction. I think, of course, it is the case that we have a very fractured ecosystem of journalism. But again, this is maybe my sort of age and speaking. I do think organizations like the Times and the Post and the Atlantic and our other competitors, even in a very complicated media ecosystem, are fundamentally important to journalism, to the narrative, to the democracy. And I think if I could get up on my soapbox, will be even more valuable in a few years, even though we're all concerned about AI and the impact of that. I think the sort of rigorous person source driven journalism that we all practice may feel like it's in great flux and conflict now, but is valuable at present and will be more valuable in the years to come.
I guess my take is that original reporting, consequential original reporting from whoever it is breaks through and gets attention. However, the response that I see from the public on social media and elsewhere really is polarized. And I think it's informed by this trust deficit that has been created for many reasons, but encouraged for sure by this administration, trashing the credibility of the media and denying confirmable, verifiable information. So there's a trust deficit for many reasons on both sides, but I do see that contributing to what happens to these stories once they get out in the world.
Anyone else on that one? Well, then I'm going to zoom out for the time that we have left. We focused, on what it's like to report in Washington and what it's like to report at the Pentagon. But I'm curious from everyone what you're hearing from your colleagues who are working overseas. What is changing when it comes to press freedom overseas and just security of your journalists who are working overseas?
It's more challenging than it has been. In part, the truth is that American sponsorship of press freedom around the world helps all of us, and it helps local journalists, but it also helps international journalists. We had a local journalist who was working with one of our teams in Zimbabwe during the Biden administration. He was arrested on trumped up charges, and I was trying to get the embassy in Zimbabwe interested in the case. Didn't hear back from them. By the time I woke up the next morning, they'd already gone on Twitter attacking the Zimbabwean government for what they were doing and beating the drum for press freedom. They didn't need me to tell them to do that. They thought that was part of what their mission was. And, you see that in the first Trump administration, when the term fake news becomes currency, that around the world, countries pass fake news laws, Singapore, Indonesia, everywhere. And those are not rooting out fake news. Those are rooting out news that the administrations of those countries don't want. So I think that's difficult. The security situation remains, troubling as well. I think all of the news organizations have gotten more sophisticated about providing security in difficult places. But it really still depends on not allowing journalists to be harmed and killed with impunity, which we see in various places around the world.
Empirically, the latest Reporters Without Borders index, we're at a global 25-year low for press freedom. So this is, what's happening here is not happening in isolation. And there is that element of, copycat, sort of wannabe dictators are learning from each other about how to do this. And I think the response is that journalists also need to learn from each other about how to resist. But I would just highlight in this conversation that we really can't understate the impact of the effort to dismantle Voice of America, it's Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, institutions that have supported the ethos of a free press around the world to the benefit of people in country in those places, but also ultimately to everyone here.
Ms. Ben, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess, just to echo what Beck and David said, the power of our example is significant, even if the United States is less involved in free press promotion activities, the kind it used to do as part of, extension of USAID and some of the assistance. But I do remember very well, this is probably back in 2008 or 2009 when I worked in Iraq, and just being so shocked. It was the first time I had ever seen a government come out and issue a statement and name a news organization. I worked for Reuters at the time, and it was a story that we wrote that they didn't like, and it seemed so unprofessional and shocking to me. And this was at a moment where the United States, they had just emerged from this grisly dictatorship, and the United States was trying to help them build the kind of free press that the United States has. Fast forward almost 20 years later, this is routine in the United States. And I do think that gives permission for people not to feel like leaders in other countries feel like they need to observe a modicum of, respect and tolerance and give that kind of crucial civil space.
Okay, well, on that note, unfortunately, I think we've run out of time. In the spirit of tracking these issues and not normalizing them the way we've just heard, it's fascinating to hear that just over a decade ago, it was shocking to hear this kind of language directed at the press, and now it really is. You sort of brush it off in some respect just to continue to do your job. You can't sort of be consumed with the noise of it all, but it would be wonderful to reconvene, in a year and a half from now and see where we are and just take the temperature. So I want to thank our panelists so much for doing this. This has been really helpful, and thank our audience for joining us, and also our hosts, the Reiss Center and Just Security, for hosting the conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.